Do you believe in miracles? If not, this video might change your mind. It tells the story of a mysterious voice from the sky that guided a commercial airline pilot to save hundreds of lives in 2018. This is the story of Captain Rico Setiawan. The sun was setting on September 28, 2018, casting a warm glow over Mutiara CS Al Jufri Airport in Palu. It seemed like an ordinary evening, a typical workday for Captain Rico Setiawan of Batik Air. A seasoned pilot with years of experience, Rico was known for his calm demeanor, meticulous preparation, and steady hand at the controls. But today felt different. As Rico walked into the airport toward his aircraft, a strange sense of urgency gripped him. It wasn't anxiety, it was sharper, more insistent, like an invisible hand pushing him forward. He couldn't identify the source of the feeling, but it was impossible to ignore. Glancing at the clock, he saw there was still time to prepare at a normal pace, but his instincts told him otherwise. Something deep inside urged him to move faster, to ready the plane for departure without delay. Reaching the cockpit, the sensation intensified. As he performed his pre-flight checks, a peculiar thought surfaced in his mind. Leave now. Get out as soon as possible. The voice was clear, firm, and unrelenting. Rico froze, gripping the edge of his seat. It wasn't his own inner voice. It felt as though it came from somewhere beyond his understanding. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it, but the message persisted. Resolving to follow this inexplicable instinct, Rico sprang into action. He called the cabin crew and ground staff to expedite the boarding process. "Please move quickly. I want this plane in the air as soon as possible," he said, his tone carrying an urgency that surprised his colleagues. The flight attendants exchanged puzzled looks. Rico wasn't known for rushing. On the contrary, he was methodical and measured, rarely letting time pressures interfere with his work. The ground staff hesitated. Boarding had only just begun, and they were unsure why the haste was necessary. His co-pilot, a younger man named Yusuf, finally spoke up. "Captain, are we expecting bad weather or something?" "No," Rico replied tersely. He didn't elaborate. How could he? How could he explain a feeling he couldn't even justify to himself? Instead, he moved past Yusuf and began helping the ground staff directly, loading luggage into the cargo hold and clearing unnecessary equipment. The flight attendants were stunned. Rico was not one to involve himself in these tasks. He was a captain, a leader who trusted his crew to handle their roles while he focused on his own. Yet here he was, sweating alongside the ground crew, urging them to move faster. "We've never seen him like this," one attendant whispered. "What's going on?" By the time boarding was complete, Rico had personally cleaned the cabin, wiped down trays, and checked overhead compartments. His hands trembled, not from exhaustion but from the intensity of the feeling driving him. The cabin crew, irritated by the rush, muttered under their breath as they strapped in for takeoff. Rico noticed their discontent but didn't address it. There was no time to explain. The voice in his mind remained insistent. Go now. At 18:02, the engines roared to life and the plane began taxiing to the runway. Rico's focus was absolute. The usual banter with the co-pilot and crew was absent. He was entirely absorbed in the act of departure. As the plane accelerated, he felt a faint jolt, subtle but distinct enough to catch his attention. He dismissed it as a minor irregularity in the runway, perhaps a small maintenance issue. With steady hands, he guided the plane into the air, its rear wheels smoothly lifting off the tarmac. In the moments following takeoff, Rico and his co-pilot tried to contact the tower. The radio remained silent. Typically, the tower would provide updates during their ascent, but no response came. "Mutiara Tower, this is Batik 6231, Rico called. Silence. He repeated the call, but still there was no reply. The instruments indicated no mechanical problems and the flight ascended steadily toward cruising altitude. Yet something felt off. As the aircraft climbed steadily, Rico's attention turned to the view outside the cockpit. Below, the coastline stretched out, but the ocean seemed strange. The water rippled unnaturally, as though disturbed by an unseen force. He squinted and leaned forward for a clearer view. "Yusuf," he said, pointing at the window, "do you see that?" The co-pilot leaned in as well. "The waves, they're massive," he said, his voice laced with confusion. "But the sea is calm. What's causing it?" The rest of the flight was uneventful, and they landed safely in Makassar. Passengers disembarked, some thanking the crew for a smooth journey. To them, it had been just another flight. Rico, however, felt a heaviness settle over him as he walked through the terminal. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, and when he opened one, his heart sank. Massive earthquake hits Palu. Tsunami devastates coastal areas. Widespread destruction reported. Rico froze, the words blurring before his eyes. The earthquake had struck at 1802, the precise moment they took off. His mind raced. The jolt during takeoff, the unusual waves, the urgency to leave. Everything clicked. They hadn't just avoided disaster, they had been seconds away from being consumed by it. It turned out the jolt they felt was no minor issue. At the exact moment the plane ascended, the ground below began to rupture. Roads crumbled. The control tower swayed violently and the runway fractured. But Flight 6231 was already airborne, its passengers and crew oblivious to the chaos below. Later, devastating news reached Rico. The control tower had collapsed during the earthquake, and Agung, the air traffic controller who cleared their takeoff, had perished in the rubble. Witnesses described how Agung stayed at his post, issuing instructions until the very end. His calm, steady voice had ensured Rico's flight departed safely. The weight of what had happened struck Rico deeply. Agung's sacrifice, the unexplainable urgency, the timing of their takeoff, it was too extraordinary to dismiss as coincidence. That night, Rico sat alone in his hotel room, replaying the events. He didn't know what to call it. Divine intervention, fate, intuition. But he knew they had been spared by forces beyond comprehension. In the days that followed, Rico returned to Palu to witness the devastation. The sight of the collapsed control tower brought tears to his eyes. He learned more about Agung's final moments and how his heroism ensured their safety. Agung's name became synonymous with courage, and Rico made it his mission to share his story with the world. To this day, Rico speaks of that flight, the urgency that saved them, and the bravery of the man in the tower. Every time he steps into a cockpit, he carries the memory of Agung and the miracle that allowed them to rise above the destruction below.